In the blistering drought of July 1878, in the dust-choked cattle town of Willow Creek, Montana, a desperate father's mounting debts would shatter one family and forever alter the life of a young woman who never imagined her world could collapse so completely. What began as the most humiliating day in Eliza Winters' life would become the beginning of a revelation that would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about her past, her worth, and the true meaning of family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered porch of the Winters family farm as Eliza carefully mended her father's work shirt, her skilled fingers moving steadily despite the pain that had become her constant companion. At 23, Eliza possessed a quiet resilience that came from years of adapting to a body that had betrayed her. Her right leg, withered and weakened by childhood polio, had shaped her life in ways both visible and hidden, teaching her patience and determination, even as it limited her prospects in the harsh frontier world. Her father, Thomas Winters, watched her from the doorway, his once proud shoulders now bent with shame and defeat. He had been Willow Creek's most respected horse breeder, a man whose eye for quality stock had earned him a comfortable living and the respect of ranchers throughout the territory. The Winters family had lived modestly but well on their small homestead just outside town, with Thomas bringing home stories of magnificent stallions and Eliza filling journals with poetry that captured the wild beauty of Montana territory. "Eliza," Thomas began, his voice cracking with emotion he could barely contain, "I need to speak with you about something important." Eliza set aside her mending, her heart sinking at the unfamiliar desperation in her father's tone. Since her mother's death from fever 5 years earlier, she had become attuned to the subtle shifts in his moods, the weight of responsibility he carried alone. "What is it, Pa?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly despite the fear blooming in her chest. Thomas sat heavily on the porch step beside her, his weathered hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. "The bank's calling in our loans tomorrow, all of them." Eliza felt the world tilt beneath her. She had known their financial situation was precarious. The severe drought had devastated their breeding stock, and the medical expenses from her mother's long illness had depleted their savings, but she hadn't realized they stood at the edge of complete ruin. "How much do we owe?" she asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. $3,000, Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And according to these papers, if I can't pay by noon tomorrow, Jackson Carter can claim our farm and everything on it." The name sent a chill through Eliza's blood. Jackson Carter, the wealthiest cattle baron in the county, had been systematically acquiring struggling homesteads throughout the territory. His methods were notorious, extending credit to desperate families, with terms that seemed reasonable until the fine print revealed clauses allowing him to claim far more than the original debt. "Carter's men came by yesterday," Thomas continued, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. "They said there's another option besides losing the farm outright." "What kind of option?" Eliza asked, though something in her father's broken expression told her she wouldn't like the answer. Thomas took a deep breath. "In these territories, there's an old law still on the books. If a man can't pay his debts, he can offer family labor as compensation." Eliza's hands stilled on her mending. "What exactly does that mean, Pa?" "It means that tomorrow at noon in the town square," his voice faltered, "they're going to auction your domestic services to settle our debt." The full implication of his words hung in the air between them. In frontier Montana, domestic services could mean anything from housekeeping to a forced marriage, with few protections for the woman involved. For a woman with a disability, the prospects were even more frightening: hard labor that would break her body completely, or worse, exhibition as an oddity for someone's amusement. "No," she whispered, her hands gripping the porch railing. There has to be another way. Thomas shook his head, years of failure etched in the lines of his face. I've tried everything, Eliza. I've begged for extensions, offered to work off the debt myself, tried to sell everything we could spare. Carter isn't interested in compromises. He wants our land because it controls access to the North Valley water rights. This auction is just a formality. He's already arranged for one of his foremen to place the winning bid. Eliza felt a cold determination replace her initial shock. All her life, people had underestimated her because of her leg, had seen her as less valuable, less capable. Even now, Carter saw her as merely a pawn in his land acquisition scheme, not as a human being with dignity and dreams of her own. Then we'll run, she said, reaching for her cane. Tonight. We can pack what we can carry and head for Oregon or California. Thomas looked at her with eyes that had aged years in the space of days. They're watching the farm, Eliza. Carter's. Men are camped just over the ridge. If we try to leave, they'll claim we're violating the terms of the loan, and they can have us arrested. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The prison of their circumstances closed around Eliza like iron bars. She had spent her life fighting against limitations, refusing to be defined by what she couldn't do. But this trap seemed inescapable, engineered with cruel precision to leave them no path to freedom. That night, as darkness settled over the Montana plains, Eliza sat at her mother's old writing desk, penning what might be her final entry in the journal that had been her confidant through years of hardship. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the page as she wrote words that reflected both despair and defiance. Tomorrow I am to be sold like cattle to pay debts I never incurred, she wrote, her normally graceful handwriting made jagged by emotion. The world sees only my twisted leg and thinks it defines me, but I am more than this broken body. Whatever comes tomorrow, I will not surrender my spirit, even if my physical freedom is taken. Mother, if you can see me from beyond, give me the strength to face whatever awaits with dignity. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Eliza dressed with deliberate care in her mother's blue calico dress, the nicest garment she owned. She braided her copper-red hair, secured it with a ribbon, and polished the brass handle of the maple cane that had been her constant companion since childhood. If she was to be humiliated publicly, she would face it with whatever dignity she could muster. The journey into town was silent, Thomas too consumed by shame to speak, Eliza too focused on controlling her fear to offer consolation. The wagon jolted over the rutted road, each bump sending pain through her damaged leg, a physical reminder of the vulnerability that had shaped her life and now threatened to determine her future. Willow Creek's town square was already crowded. When they arrived, filled with a mixture of legitimate townspeople and rougher-looking men, who had clearly traveled from outlying ranches specifically for the auction. Eliza felt their eyes on her as Thomas helped her down from the wagon, heard the whispers that followed her halting progress toward the courthouse steps. Some gazes held pity, others held something darker and more predatory. Jackson Carter stood near the courthouse entrance, a tall, imposing figure in an expensive suit that set him apart from the dusty cattlemen around him. His cold eyes assessed Eliza with the same calculating expression he might use when evaluating livestock, measuring her value in purely practical terms. "Mr. Winters," Carter said with false cordiality as they approached, "I trust you've brought the payment we discussed. It would be unfortunate to proceed with more drastic measures when a simple financial transaction could resolve everything." Thomas Winters' jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You know I don't have the money, Carter. If I did, we wouldn't be here." "A pity," Carter replied, though his tone suggested anything but regret. "Well, perhaps today's proceedings will work out favorably for everyone involved. I've taken the liberty of ensuring that qualified bidders are present, Men who understand the value of acquiring domestic help with proper breeding. Eliza felt sick at the thinly veiled implication. This wasn't just about domestic labor. It was about acquiring a woman with no choice but to accept whatever was demanded of her. The fact that her disability might make her less desirable to most men only meant that whoever purchased her contract would likely pay less and expect more, seeing her as a bargain rather than a person deserving of respect. Judge Henry Sullivan emerged from the courthouse, his face grim with distaste for the proceedings he was legally obligated to oversee. Sullivan had been a friend of Eliza's mother, and the look he gave Thomas conveyed both sympathy and disappointment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Sullivan called out, his voice carrying reluctantly across the crowd, "we are gathered today to conduct a public auction in accordance with Montana territorial law for the purpose of satisfying the legitimate debts of Thomas Winters of this county." Eliza took her position on the courthouse steps, standing as straight as her weakened leg would allow, her cane planted firmly beside her. She fixed her gaze on a point above the crowd's heads, refusing to acknowledge the evaluating stares that stripped her of humanity. The auction began with the Winters household items and farm equipment. Eliza watched numbly as her mother's cherished china set sold for pennies on the dollar to Mrs. Patterson from the mercantile. The family's modest library went to the schoolteacher, Mr. Adams, who at least would ensure the books were well cared for and shared with others. Each item represented a piece of their family's history being stripped away and scattered, the physical manifestation of a life being dismantled piece by piece. Through it all, Jackson Carter watched with the satisfied expression of a predator who knows his prey cannot escape. Then came the moment Eliza had been dreading. Judge Sullivan consulted his papers with obvious reluctance before making the announcement that would change everything. "The final item for auction," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is a 7-year domestic service contract for Miss Eliza Winters, age 23, trained in household management and fine needlework." The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she waited for the first voice to shatter her last moments of freedom. "$20 for the crippled girl," called out a rough voice from the back of the crowd. Eliza couldn't see the speaker, but his tone suggested the kind of man who viewed women as property to be owned rather than partners to be cherished. $30, countered another voice, and Eliza's heart sank as she recognized Frank Wilson, a widower known for working his last housekeeper to exhaustion before she fled in the night, leaving behind most of her possessions. $50, called Carter's foreman, exactly as Thomas had predicted. The bid was low enough to be insulting, but high enough that few in the struggling town could afford to counter it. The bidding continued in small increments, each increase representing another potential future, each voice carrying its own implications for what her life might become. Eliza stood motionless, her knuckles white around the handle of her cane, as men casually determined her fate as if discussing the price of cattle. $100, said Wilson, his eyes traveling over Eliza in a way that made her skin crawl. $120, countered Carter's man, with the casual confidence of someone who knows his employer's pockets are deeper than anyone else's in the territory. Eliza closed her eyes briefly, accepting that within minutes she would be legally bound to serve Jackson Carter's interests, becoming another piece of property acquired in his relentless expansion. When she opened them again, she noticed a disturbance at the edge of the crowd. A tall figure on horseback had arrived, causing townspeople to step aside as the rider made his way toward the courthouse steps. The newcomer was a stranger to Eliza, a man in his mid-30s whose clothing suggested a successful rancher rather than a common cowhand. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. $500, the stranger called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. $500 was a small fortune in Willow Creek, more than many families saw in a year. Carter's foreman turned to his employer with obvious confusion, waiting for instructions on how to respond to this unexpected development. Jackson Carter stepped forward, his practiced composure slipping slightly. "And you are, sir?" "Matthew Callahan," the stranger replied, dismounting with fluid grace. "Recently returned to Montana Territory after some time away." The name meant nothing to Eliza, but she noticed a flash of recognition cross Judge Sullivan's face, followed by something that looked surprisingly like hope. $500 is a substantial sum for a domestic service contract, Carter said, recovering his composure. "Especially for a girl with physical limitations." Matthew Callahan's gaze moved to Eliza for the first time, and she was startled by the intensity of his blue eyes. Unlike the other bidders, he didn't assess her as property or evaluate her physical limitations. Instead, his gaze held something that seemed almost like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. "I believe I understand the value of what I'm bidding on," Callahan replied evenly. "Do I hear a counteroffer, or shall we conclude this business?" Carter hesitated, clearly calculating whether the land was worth an additional investment beyond what he had planned. Finally, he nodded to his foreman. $600. $1,000. Callahan responded immediately, without hesitation. The crowd erupted in astonished murmurs. No domestic service contract in the history of the territory had ever commanded such a price. It was clear that something beyond simple economics was driving this unexpected bidding war. Carter's face darkened with anger. "This is highly irregular. I question whether this gentleman actually has the funds to support such an extravagant bid." In response, Callahan reached into his coat and withdrew a bank draft, which he handed to Judge Sullivan. "I believe you'll find everything in order, Your Honor." Sullivan examined the draft carefully, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "The bid appears to be legitimate and fully funded, Mr. Carter. Do you wish to continue?" Carter's cold calculation was visible on his face as he weighed his options. Finally, he shook his head. "I withdraw from the bidding." "Sold to Mr. Matthew Callahan for $1,000, Judge Sullivan announced, bringing down his gavel with what sounded to Eliza like relief rather than regret. Thomas Winters stood in shocked silence, unable to process this unexpected turn of events. His daughter had just been purchased by a complete stranger for a sum that would not only clear their debts but leave them with a modest surplus. Yet the victory felt hollow, knowing that Eliza's freedom had been the price. Matthew Callahan approached the courthouse steps where Eliza still stood, her face a mask of dignified resignation. When he spoke, his voice was pitched low enough that only she could hear him. "Miss Winters, I know this situation is far from ideal, but I promise you have nothing to fear from me. There are things you need to know about why I'm here and what this arrangement truly means." Eliza found her voice despite her shock. "Mr. Callahan, I appreciate your intervention, but I should be honest about my circumstances. I have a permanent disability that limits certain types of physical labor. If you've purchased my contract expecting a fully able-bodied servant, you should know the truth." Callahan studied her face carefully, and Eliza thought she saw a flicker of something sadness. Respect, perhaps even admiration in his expression. "Miss Winters, you may find that your circumstances are quite different from what you've been led to believe. But this is neither the time nor the place for such discussions. First, we need to complete the legal formalities, and then there are revelations that will change how you understand your family's history." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "What kind of revelations?" "The kind that explain why I traveled 500 miles specifically to attend today's auction," Callahan replied. "And why your situation has been of particular interest to me for reasons that go far beyond a simple business arrangement." Thomas Winters, who had been standing in stunned silence since the bidding ended, stepped forward with confusion written Across his face, "Mr. Callahan, I don't understand. How could my daughter's situation possibly be of interest to someone of your standing? We're just a horse-breeding family that's fallen on hard times." Callahan turned to face Thomas with an expression that was both gentle and profound. "Mr. Winters, you may find that your family's connection to the horse-breeding industry runs much deeper than you realize. But first, let's complete today's business, and then I'll explain everything." The contract signing took place in Judge Sullivan's chambers, with only the legally required witnesses present. Eliza sat beside Matthew Callahan, her hand trembling as she signed the documents that would bind her to 7 years of service to this stranger. Yet as she watched him sign his own name with confident strokes, she noticed something odd about his manner. He showed none of the possessive satisfaction she might have expected from a man who had just purchased control over another human being. Instead, when he looked at her during the proceedings, she saw something that gave her pause. Not desire or ownership, but what almost seemed like recognition, as if he were seeing someone he had known for a long time. After the ceremony concluded and the witnesses dispersed, Callahan turned to address Eliza and her father in Judge Sullivan's private office. "Before we go any further, I want to make something clear," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed natural rather than forced. "While this contract is legally binding, it doesn't require anything from you, Miss Winters, that you're not willing to give freely. You'll have your own accommodations, your own resources, and complete freedom to make your own choices about how you spend your time." Eliza stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Callahan, you just paid a small fortune for my service contract. Surely you expect something in return." "I expect the opportunity to correct a great injustice that was done to your family many years ago," Callahan replied. "And I hope, given time and understanding, that we might build something genuine between us. But I won't demand anything from you beyond the patience to hear me explain why I'm really here." Eliza had been studying Callahan's face with the keen observation skills she had developed during years of watching people's reactions to her disability. "You look familiar," she said suddenly. "I feel like I've seen you before, but I know we've never met." Callahan smiled, and for the first time, Eliza saw genuine warmth in his expression. "You have excellent instincts, Miss Winters. You have seen me before. Or rather, you've seen someone who looked very much like me. The family resemblance is quite strong." Thomas Winters had been listening to this exchange with growing bewilderment. "What family resemblance? What are you talking about?" Callahan reached into his coat and withdrew a small daguerreotype, which he handed to Thomas with careful reverence. "This is a photograph of my brother taken shortly before his death 12 years ago. I believe you knew him well." Thomas Winters looked at the photograph and went completely pale. His hands began to shake as he studied the face in the image, a face that was unmistakably similar to Callahan's, but younger, with the same intelligent eyes and confident bearing. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered. "This can't be real." Eliza moved to look at the photograph over her father's shoulder and felt her own shock as she recognized features that seemed hauntingly familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Callahan, but something about his eyes and the set of his jaw triggered memories she couldn't quite access. "Papa," Eliza said, her voice tight with a growing realization. "Who is this man?" Thomas Winters continued staring at the photograph, as if it were a ghost come to life. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "This is Joseph Callahan. He was my partner in the horse breeding business, my closest friend, and—" He paused, struggling with words that would change everything. "And he was your mother's first husband." The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that Eliza could hear her own heartbeat. Everything she thought she knew about her family, her identity, and her place in the world suddenly shifted like ground giving way beneath her feet. Matthew Callahan watched the Winters family process this information with the patience of a man who had waited years for this moment. "Now you understand why I traveled so far to be here today," he said gently, "and why your situation has been of such particular interest to me." Eliza felt the world spinning around her as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. "Are you saying I'm not really Eliza Winters? That my father isn't really my father? Thomas Winters is the man who raised you, who loved you, who taught you everything you know about courage and perseverance," Matthew replied carefully. "But by birth, you are Eliza Callahan, daughter of Joseph Callahan and Elizabeth Winters." Thomas set the photograph down with shaking hands. "We should go somewhere more private to discuss this. There's much to explain." "My carriage is waiting," Matthew said. "I've arranged accommodations at the Double C Ranch where we can speak freely without the entire town speculating about our conversation." As they left the courthouse, Eliza was acutely aware of the stares following them. The townspeople of Willow Creek had witnessed something extraordinary. A crippled girl sold for an unprecedented sum to a wealthy stranger, and the speculation was already spreading like wildfire. But none of them could possibly imagine the truth that was beginning to unfold. Matthew's carriage was luxurious by frontier standards, with well-padded seats and a specially designed step that made it easier for Eliza to climb aboard, despite her disability. The thoughtful accommodation suggested that Matthew had prepared specifically for her needs, further evidence that this encounter was far from coincidental. As they traveled away from Willow Creek toward the mountains, Eliza struggled to process everything that had happened. The auctioning of her service contract, which had seemed like the end of her freedom, had somehow become the beginning of a journey into an identity she hadn't known existed. "The Double C Ranch lies about 10 miles northwest of here," Matthew explained as they traveled. "It was established by the Callahan family 20 years ago as one of the first horse breeding operations in the territory." "I've heard of it," Thomas said quietly. "One of the most successful ranches in Montana. Specializes in quarter horses and thoroughbreds." "It was my brother's vision," Matthew confirmed. Joseph Callahan believed that Montana would become prime horse country with its vast grasslands and clear water. He invested everything in building a breeding program that would produce animals suited to both racing and ranch work. The landscape changed as they traveled, the dry plains giving way to lusher foothills where streams carved pathways through rolling meadows. Finally, they crested a rise, and Eliza gasped at the vista that opened before them. A sprawling ranch, spread across a verdant valley with white-painted buildings, extensive corrals, and pastures where magnificent horses grazed in the afternoon sun. "Welcome to the Callahan Ranch," Matthew said softly. "Or as Joseph always called it, your birthright." The main house was a 2-story structure built of timber and local stone, with wide verandas and large windows that captured the spectacular mountain views. As their carriage approached, staff emerged to greet them with the quiet efficiency that spoke of wealth and established order. A distinguished older woman in a housekeeper's dress stepped forward as Matthew helped Eliza from the carriage. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Hamilton," he explained. "She has managed Callahan households for over 15 years and will see to your comfort during your stay. Mrs. Hamilton, this is Miss Eliza Winters and her father, Thomas Winters," Matthew continued. "They will be our honored guests while we discuss family matters of great importance." Eleanor Hamilton curtsied slightly. "Miss Winters, Mr. Winters, your rooms have been prepared. I've taken the liberty of arranging for suitable clothing and personal items based on the information Mr. Matthew provided." Eliza felt overwhelmed by the grandeur around her and the implications of what she was hearing. "Mrs. Hamilton, I should mention that I have no experience with formal households, and my disability makes certain activities difficult." The housekeeper smiled warmly. "Your mother was much the same when she first joined the family, Miss Eliza. She adapted beautifully, and I have no doubt you will as well. We've made specific accommodations for your comfort, including a suite on the ground floor to avoid stairs." As they were shown to their rooms, Eliza marveled at the attention to detail that had gone into preparing for their arrival. Her chamber was spacious and elegant, with a specially designed washstand at a height that accommodated her need to sometimes sit while performing daily tasks. The bed was lower than standard, making it easier to access without assistance, and a beautiful maple cane far finer than her own weathered one stood in a rack by the door. "How did you know?" she asked Matthew, gesturing to the thoughtful accommodations. "I've spent years learning everything about you," he replied simply. "Your mother's condition was well documented, and medical experts I consulted suggested that her daughter might face similar challenges. I wanted to ensure that when we finally met, you would feel welcomed rather than hindered." Thomas Winters moved through the elegant room with the discomfort of a man suddenly confronted with a world he didn't understand. "This is all so different from anything Eliza has known, from anything I could provide for her." "Please don't think of it that way," Matthew said gently. "You gave Eliza something far more valuable than material comforts. You gave her love, stability, and moral character during extraordinary circumstances. No one could have done more." After allowing them time to refresh themselves, Matthew invited Eliza and Thomas to join him in the library for the conversation. That would change everything. The room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable leather chairs, and large windows that framed the mountains like living paintings. As they settled around the fireplace, Eliza noticed a portrait hanging above the mantel, a handsome young man with Matthew's features, but softer eyes and a more contemplative expression. "Is that him? Is that Joseph Callahan?" "Yes, Matthew." "Confirmed. That's my brother, painted just after he established this ranch. And this," he said, indicating a smaller portrait beside it, "is your mother, Elizabeth Walsh, painted shortly after their marriage." Eliza stared at the young woman in the portrait, searching for resemblances to her own face. The woman had her same copper-red hair and green eyes, but more than that, the portrait captured a determination and intelligence that Eliza recognized from her own mirror. "She was beautiful," Eliza whispered. "She was extraordinary," Matthew corrected. "Brilliant, determined, and utterly fearless in pursuing what she believed was right. Joseph fell in love with her mind first, her spirit second, and her beauty was almost an afterthought." Thomas Winters studied the portrait with old pain in his eyes. "She never told me the full truth about her first marriage. She said her husband had died in a riding accident and that his family had rejected her afterward, but she never mentioned the Callahan name or anything about this ranch. She was protecting herself and her daughter," Matthew said gently. Elizabeth had learned that the Callahan family name brought more pain than benefit. When she met you, Thomas, she saw a chance to build a new life based on love and mutual respect rather than wealth and painful memories. Eliza was beginning to understand the scope of what she was learning, so my mother deliberately concealed my true identity. "Why?" Matthew sighed deeply and poured brandy for himself and Thomas, offering Eliza a glass of fine sherry. "That's the heart of our story, and it begins with how your parents met." He settled into his chair, his expression reflecting the weight of family history. Elizabeth Walsh was the daughter of a Butte schoolteacher who died when she was 19, leaving her with excellent education but few prospects. She took a position as a governess with the Henderson family in Helena in 1865. Teaching their children and managing their household with remarkable efficiency. "How did she meet Joseph?" Eliza asked, drawn into the story of her true origins. "My brother was 26 in 1866, heir to the Callahan ranching fortune, but rebellious about the expectations that came with wealth and position. He had been sent to Helena to negotiate cattle contracts, work that our father hoped would teach him responsibility and prepare him for eventually taking control of the family business." Matthew paused, taking a sip of his brandy before continuing. "Joseph was brilliant with horses and business strategy. But he chafed under the social restrictions that governed wealthy families in the Pumleys, in the Cabozas, and business strategy. But he chafed under the social restrictions that governed wealthy families in the 1860s. He was expected to marry within his social class, to choose a wife based on family connections and financial advantages rather than personal compatibility. Eliza understood immediately. He fell in love with my mother despite the social differences. He fell in love with her because of her intelligence, her strength, and her refusal to be intimidated by wealth or position, Matthew confirmed. Elizabeth Walsh was unlike any woman Joseph had ever met. She was educated, independent, and completely unimpressed by the Callahan family name or fortune. Thomas nodded, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time since the revelations. She was still like that when I met her. Elizabeth never cared about money or status. She judged people by their character and their actions, nothing else. The courtship between Joseph and Elizabeth lasted nearly a year, Matthew explained. They met in secret, communicating through letters and clandestine meetings that violated every social convention of the time. Joseph knew that their father would never approve of the match, while Elizabeth understood that marrying into the Callahan family would bring her into a world where she would always be viewed as an outsider. But they married anyway, Eliza said, feeling a connection to parents she had never truly known. They married in a private ceremony in December 1866, with only 2 witnesses present and no family members from either side, Matthew confirmed. Joseph had planned to present the marriage to our father as a fait accompli, hoping that once the deed was done, the family would accept Elizabeth rather than risk a public scandal. The pain in Matthew's voice suggested that this strategy had not succeeded. Eliza felt a growing sense of dread about what had happened to tear her parents apart. What went wrong? Our father, William Callahan, was a man who believed that family bloodlines and social position were sacred trusts that could not be compromised for individual desires, Matthew explained. When Joseph announced his marriage, William threatened to disinherit him completely unless he agreed to have the marriage annulled and choose a more suitable wife. Matthew moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as if they contained images of the past he was describing. Joseph refused. Of course. He loved Elizabeth deeply and believed that our father would eventually relent once he had time to adjust to the situation. But he didn't relent, Thomas said, understanding the trajectory of the story. William Callahan was as stubborn as he was wealthy, Matthew confirmed. He cut off Joseph's access to family funds, removed him from his position with the ranching operation, and made it clear that as long as he remained married to Elizabeth, he would have no place in the Callahan family. Eliza was beginning to understand the forces that had shaped her early life. So my father was forced to choose between love and responsibility, between his wife and his family's legacy. The crisis came to a head in the spring of 1867 when Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant, Matthew continued. Joseph realized that he could no longer afford to wait for his father's change of heart. He needed steady employment and financial security to support his growing family. Matthew returned to his chair, his expression heavy with the weight of family tragedy. Joseph made the most difficult decision of his life. He accepted a position as a horse buyer for the U.S. Cavalry, work that would take him away from Helena for months at a time, but would provide the income Elizabeth needed. The position involved traveling throughout the Montana Territory, dangerous work in remote areas where he faced harsh weather, difficult terrain, and occasional conflicts with hostile groups who opposed the cavalry's presence. Joseph planned to complete one major government contract, earn enough money to establish financial independence, and then return to Helena to build a new life with Elizabeth and their child, Matthew explained. But he never came back. Thomas Winters' voice was barely audible when he spoke. He died before Eliza was born. Joseph and 2 other cavalry agents were attacked by a band of renegades in October 1867 during a snowstorm. Matthew confirmed. They were found weeks later by a military patrol. By the time word reached Helena, Elizabeth was in the final stages of her pregnancy, alone and without resources. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Eliza felt tears building as she imagined her mother's devastation at learning that her husband had died in such a terrible way, leaving her alone with an unborn child and no family support. "What happened to my mother after Joseph died?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. Elizabeth received word of Joseph's death while she was still preparing for childbirth, Matthew explained. She had no family of her own to turn to, no resources beyond the small amount of money Joseph had left, and no legal claim to the Callahan family fortune since William had never acknowledged their marriage. Matthew's voice carried the weight of old guilt as he continued. William learned of Joseph's death and the existence of a grandchild, but his pride prevented him from reaching out to Elizabeth. He convinced himself that she and the child would be better off without the complications that came with Callahan family connections. So he abandoned them, Eliza said, anger building in her voice. He let his own grandchild grow up in poverty, rather than admit he had been wrong about my mother. William Callahan died 3 years later, taking his regrets and his pride to the grave, Matthew said. By the time I inherited control of the family business and began looking for Joseph's widow and child, Elizabeth had disappeared completely. Thomas Morrison finally joined the conversation fully, his voice heavy with old pain. Elizabeth never told me the complete truth about her first marriage. She said her husband had died before their child was born and that his family had rejected her, but she never mentioned the Callahan name or the extent of the wealth involved. She was protecting herself and her child, Matthew said gently. Elizabeth had learned that the Callahan family name brought more pain than benefit. When she met you, Thomas, she saw a chance to build a new life based on love and mutual respect, rather than wealth and social position. Eliza was beginning to understand the full scope of the deception that had shaped her life. So when she married Papa, she deliberately concealed my true identity to protect me from a family that had already rejected us once. Elizabeth changed your name from Callahan to Winters, altered your birth records slightly, and created a new history that would allow you to grow up as a normal child rather than a disinherited heir to a fortune that might never be recoverable. Matthew confirmed. And the polio? Eliza asked quietly. Was that part of why she hid me away? Matthew shook his head firmly. No, Eliza. Your mother's decision to hide your identity had nothing to do with your health. The polio came later, when you were 5 years old. I've pieced together the timeline from local medical records. By then, Elizabeth and Thomas were already married, and you were being raised as Eliza Winters. Thomas reached across the space between them to take Eliza's hand. Your mother fought like a lioness when you fell ill. She stayed by your side day and night for weeks, reading to you, exercising your limbs, refusing to accept the doctor's prediction that you might not survive. She sacrificed everything for me, Eliza whispered, the magnitude of her mother's love finally clear to her. She sacrificed her inheritance to give you the chance for genuine happiness, Matthew said. And from what I've learned about you over these past months, her sacrifice was not in vain. You've become a woman of extraordinary character, resilience, and intelligence, exactly the qualities that define both of your parents. Eliza looked around the magnificent library that represented her true heritage. Now everything has changed again. I'm a Callahan by birth, with all the wealth and responsibility that comes with that name. You're a Callahan by birth and by right, Matthew corrected. But you're also a Winters by choice and by experience. You have the unique advantage of understanding both worlds, of appreciating both wealth and simplicity. The evening had grown late while Matthew shared their family's history, and Eliza realized that she was exhausted by the emotional weight of everything they had learned. Uncle Matthew, she said, using the family designation for the first time. I need time to process all of this, to understand what it means for my future and how I'm supposed to navigate a world I've never been part of. Of course, Matthew replied with understanding. Tomorrow we'll begin the practical aspects of your education as a member of the Callahan family. There are business interests to learn about, social obligations to understand, and decisions to make about how you want to use your inheritance. As they prepared to retire to their respective rooms, Eliza approached the portrait of her birth father, studying the face that had helped create her own. What was he like? Beyond the facts of his life, who was Joseph Callahan? Matthew's expression softened with memory. Joseph was the finest horseman in Montana territory, with an almost mystical ability to communicate with even the most difficult animals. He was also a dreamer and a builder, a man who saw the future of this land when others saw only wilderness. But most importantly, he was kind and just, treating every person he met with the same respect regardless of their station in life. I wish I could have known him, Eliza said softly. In many ways you do know him, Matthew replied. From what I've observed of your character, you've inherited his determination, his sense of justice, and his ability to see beyond surface appearances to the true nature of people and situations. As Eliza settled into her luxurious new bedroom that night, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in a single day. She had awakened as Eliza Winters, the crippled daughter of a bankrupt horse breeder. She was falling. Asleep as Eliza Callahan, heir to a ranching fortune and niece to a man who had traveled hundreds of miles to rescue her from circumstances that seemed hopeless. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her true inheritance wasn't money or property or social position. It was the strength and wisdom that had been passed down through generations of Callahan women, including a mother who had sacrificed everything to ensure her daughter had the chance to choose her own destiny. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, Eliza was content to rest in the knowledge that she finally understood who she truly was and where she had come from. The lost Callahan heir had been found, and her story was just beginning. Dawn broke over the Callahan ranch with golden light streaming through tall windows, illuminating a world so different from anything Eliza had known that she wondered momentarily if the previous day had been a dream. The elegant bedroom with its handcrafted furniture and fine linens bore no resemblance to the simple farmhouse room where she had spent her entire life. Only the familiar ache in her right leg as she reached for her new maple cane confirmed that she remained the same person, despite the dramatic transformation of her circumstances. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Anna Miller, a young woman assigned as Eliza's personal maid. The concept of having someone dedicated to assisting with her daily needs was foreign to Eliza, who had stubbornly insisted on self-reliance throughout her life. "Good morning, Miss Callahan," Anna said cheerfully as she entered carrying a silver tray with coffee and warm pastries. "Mr. Matthew asked me to inform you that he'll be conducting business meetings this morning to acquaint you with the Callahan Ranch operations." Eliza accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma of beans that were clearly of much higher quality than anything the Winters family had been able to afford. "Anna, I should mention that I'm not accustomed to personal service. You don't need to wait on me as if I were helpless." "Oh, but Miss Callahan, it's not about helplessness at all," Anna replied with genuine warmth. "Mr. Matthew explained that. You're a capable woman with important responsibilities to learn. My job is to handle the daily details so you can focus on more significant matters." The wardrobe laid out for the day included a riding habit modified thoughtfully to accommodate Eliza's disability, the skirt cut to allow comfortable movement. With her weakened leg, the jacket tailored to maintain balance while mounted. The attention to detail reflected Matthew's careful preparation for her arrival and his understanding of both her limitations and her determination to overcome them. Eliza found Thomas already in the breakfast room, examining a newspaper with the kind of concentrated attention that suggested he was trying to distract himself from the overwhelming transformation of their circumstances. He looked up as she entered, relief evident in his expression at seeing a familiar face amid so much change. "How did you sleep?" he asked, setting aside the paper. "Surprisingly well," she admitted, "though I kept waking up wondering if this was all an elaborate dream." "I've been doing the same," Thomas confessed. 24 hours ago, we were facing complete ruin. Now we're sitting in one of the finest homes in Montana Territory, and you're being recognized as the heir to a ranching fortune. The world has turned upside down. Matthew joined them moments later, dressed for a day of ranch business in practical clothing that nonetheless spoke of quality and taste. "I trust you both rested well. We have an important day ahead as we begin Eliza's education in the practical aspects of ranch management." The morning's first destination was Matthew's private office, a well-appointed room on the main house's ground floor that served as the command center for the Callahan ranching empire. Maps covered the walls showing property boundaries, grazing ranges, and water rights across thousands of acres. A telegraph machine allowed direct communication with markets in Denver and Chicago, while meticulous record books documented bloodlines for hundreds of horses in their breeding program. The modern ranching business, Matthew explained as he guided them through the various organizational systems, requires coordination across vast distances and careful attention to details that can make the difference between profit and disaster. He showed them breeding records that tracked lineages across generations, creating horses valued for specific traits: speed for racing stock, endurance for cavalry mounts, intelligence and agility for ranch work. The complexity was staggering, requiring scientific understanding and intuitive knowledge of animal behavior that Eliza was only beginning to appreciate. "Each breeding decision we make today affects the quality of our stock for years to come," Matthew continued, pointing to charts tracking the development of different bloodlines. "A single exceptional stallion can improve an entire generation of foals, while a poor choice can introduce weaknesses that take decades to breed out." Eliza studied the meticulous records with growing fascination. Her experience helping Thomas with their modest breeding operation had taught her to appreciate good horseflesh, but this scientific approach to systematic improvement across generations represented a different level of expertise entirely. "The thoroughbred program generates the most prestige," she observed, studying the monthly reports. "But the quarter horses provide the steadiest income with military and ranch sales." "Very good," Matthew said with obvious approval. "You've identified one of the key strategic balances in our operation. Thoroughbreds bring high prices and establish our reputation, but quarter horses pay the bills through consistent sales volume." The next phase of her education involved meeting the key personnel who manage daily operations for the Callahan Ranch. Matthew had assembled the department heads specifically to brief the newly discovered heir on their respective areas of responsibility. Robert McGregor, the breeding manager, was a weathered Scotsman with 30 years of experience who had worked his way up from stable boy to overseeing the entire equine genetic program. He explained the practical challenges of maintaining healthy bloodstock, managing breeding schedules, and ensuring that foals met the exacting standards buyers expected from Callahan horses. "Breeding fine horses isn't about romance, Miss Callahan," McGregor said with typical directness. "It's about making thousands of small decisions correctly, from feed quality to exercise regimens to which stallion meets which mare. Get enough decisions right, and people will think you're working magic." Sarah Jenkins, the training director, brought a different perspective to Eliza's education. A pioneering woman in a male-dominated field, she focused on the psychological aspects that transformed raw equine potential into reliable, responsive partners for their eventual owners. "A Callahan horse isn't just beautiful or fast," Jenkins explained with quiet passion. "It's an animal with the temperament and intelligence to form a true partnership with its rider." We succeed when we create horses that people can trust with their lives. The most eye-opening presentation came from Daniel Thompson, who managed the ranch's land and water rights. Thompson explained how the Callahan Ranch had systematically acquired key properties throughout the territory, securing access to critical water sources and seasonal grazing that allowed their operation to thrive even during drought years. Every acre we own serves a purpose in the larger system, Thompson said, showing maps that illustrated strategic land acquisitions. We don't just raise horses. We create the conditions that allow exceptional horses to develop through careful management of the entire environment. Eliza began to understand that the Callahan Ranch was not simply a horse breeding operation, but an integrated system that shaped the development of entire regions. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting. The afternoon brought her first exposure to the political aspects of large-scale ranching. Matthew arranged a meeting with Senator James Harrison, a territorial representative whose support was crucial for maintaining favorable regulations and government contracts. The ranching business operates at the intersection of private enterprise and public policy, Senator Harrison explained as they met in the ranch's formal parlor. Your success depends not only on the quality of your horses, but also on maintaining positive relationships with territorial and federal governments. Harrison outlined the complex web of regulations, land grants, and political considerations that influenced ranching operations. Military contracts provided much of their steady income, but those agreements came with obligations for specific breeding standards and delivery, schedules that required careful planning and execution. The Callahan name carries significant weight in political circles, Harrison continued. Your family's commitment to quality and fair business practices has earned respect from officials throughout the territory. Eliza had been taking notes throughout the day, her quick mind absorbing the multifaceted nature of the enterprise she had inherited. Senator Harrison, what happens if we make decisions that some politicians disagree with? Then you'll discover that politics can be as competitive and ruthless as any business, Harrison replied with a knowing smile. The key is maintaining relationships with people across the political spectrum and avoiding positions that make you unnecessary enemies. As the sun began to set, Matthew gathered Eliza and Thomas in the ranch's library for a summary of their first day's education. Both looked exhausted by the volume of information they had absorbed, but also energized by the possibilities they were beginning to understand. I want you to know, Matthew said as they settled into comfortable chairs near the fireplace, that I don't expect you to master all of this immediately. Managing a ranching empire is something that takes years to learn properly. But we do need to learn it, Eliza said with determination. This is my inheritance and my responsibility. I can't simply enjoy the benefits while leaving all the work to others. I'm glad you understand that, Matthew replied. Your mother had the same sense of responsibility when she married my brother. She refused to be simply a decorative wife and insisted on understanding the business that would support her family. Eliza looked up from her notebook where she had been reviewing the day's lessons. Uncle Matthew, I need to ask you something that's been troubling me. Are there people who object to my inheritance? People who think I don't deserve this wealth or position because of my disability? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Matthew was quiet for a moment, and Eliza sensed that she had touched on something significant that he had been reluctant to discuss. There are always people who question sudden changes in wealth and power, Matthew said carefully. Some will argue that you haven't earned your inheritance through personal effort. Others may believe that your physical condition makes you unsuitable to manage a business that traditionally requires robust health and mobility. What kind of people are raising these objections? Thomas asked, feeling a familiar protective instinct rising. Jackson Carter, for one, Matthew replied, his voice hardening. He's been systematically buying up smaller ranches throughout the county, consolidating his control over the cattle industry. The Callahan horse breeding operation represents one of the few remaining independent agricultural businesses of significant size. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. So Carter's attempt to acquire our farm through debt wasn't just about the land. He was trying to eliminate the last living Callahan heir before my true identity became known. I believe so, Matthew confirmed grimly. Once I began making inquiries about Elizabeth Winters and her daughter, word spread quickly. Carter has spies throughout the territory, and he likely realized that the Callahan fortune might soon have a legitimate heir to claim it. But how would he know about my connection to the Callahans? Eliza pressed. If my mother kept it secret all these years? Because Carter was the one who arranged the attack that killed your father, Matthew said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Joseph wasn't killed by random renegades. He was assassinated by men working for Carter, who wanted to eliminate his main competition in the horse breeding business. The revelation struck Eliza like a physical blow. The man who had tried to purchase her service contract, who would have controlled her life completely, was the same man responsible for her father's death and her family's subsequent hardships. You have proof of this? Thomas asked, his face pale with shock. Enough to be certain, though perhaps not enough for a court, Matthew admitted. I've spent 12 years gathering evidence, tracking down witnesses, and piecing together the events surrounding Joseph's death. Carter was careful to maintain distance between himself and the actual killers, but the pattern is clear to anyone who examines the circumstances carefully. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a burial shroud. Eliza had thought their greatest challenge would be learning to manage an inherited business responsibly. Now she understood that they might have to fight for the right to keep that inheritance at all. What do we need to do to protect ourselves? She asked, calling upon the same determination that had carried her through her family's previous crisis. You need to demonstrate competence in ranch management quickly and publicly, Matthew replied. You need to build alliances with people who can support your legitimacy, and you need to be prepared for challenges that may come from unexpected directions. Thomas Winters, who had been quietly observing much of the day's activities, finally spoke from his position near the window. Eliza has already survived one attempt to destroy her life through legal manipulation. She's stronger than she appears, and she's not easily intimidated. I'm counting on that strength, Matthew said, looking at his niece with an expression that mixed admiration with concern, because the challenges ahead may be more difficult than anything you've faced so far. As they prepared to end their first day of business education, Eliza realized that inheriting the Callahan fortune was not the fairy tale ending she had briefly imagined. Instead, it was the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one that would require every skill she had developed during her years of adversity. Tomorrow, Matthew said, we'll begin your practical education in horse breeding and training. You'll meet with our head wranglers, veterinarians, and riders. You'll learn the business from the ground up so that when critics question your qualifications, you can respond with knowledge and experience. Eliza stood and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds that were now her responsibility. Uncle Matthew, I want you to know that I'm not afraid of hard work or challenges. I've been preparing for this my entire life, even though I didn't know it. How so? Matthew asked with curiosity. I learned to manage with limited resources. I learned to make difficult decisions when options seemed impossible. Most importantly, I learned that physical limitations can be overcome through intelligence, determination, and creative thinking. Matthew smiled, and for the first time since revealing the threats to their inheritance, he looked genuinely optimistic about their prospects. Then you have exactly the qualities needed to succeed in the ranching business and to protect what your parents sacrificed so much to preserve. As Eliza retired to her room that night, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that continued to unfold in her life. Yesterday, she had been preparing for an auction that would end her freedom. Tonight she was preparing for a battle that would determine whether she could claim and keep the freedom and responsibility she had unexpectedly inherited. The stakes were higher than ever. But for the first time in years, Eliza felt that she had both the resources and the allies needed to prevail against whatever opposition she might face. The lost Callahan heir had been found, educated, and was rapidly becoming a force to be reckoned with in her own right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the legacy she had inherited. Eliza was ready for whatever came next. The morning of Eliza's first practical horse training session dawned crisp and clear, with autumn colors painting the Montana landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. She stood at the corral fence in the riding clothes Matthew had provided, watching as the ranch hands prepared a gentle mare for her first mounted lesson since childhood. As evening approached, they received news that would change everything. A messenger arrived from town with an urgent letter from Judge Sullivan. Matthew read the message twice before sharing its contents with Eliza and Thomas, his expression grave with implications they were only beginning to understand. "Carter has filed a formal challenge to your inheritance," he said slowly. "He's claiming that Joseph and Elizabeth's marriage was never legally valid and that you have no legitimate claim to Callahan Ranch properties." Eliza felt the ground shifting beneath her as she absorbed this news. On what grounds? "He's arguing that Joseph and Elizabeth's marriage violated territorial laws regarding property rights and inheritance, and that any child from that union cannot inherit assets that were never legally transferred to their father in the first place." Thomas's face darkened with anger. Can he do that? Can he simply challenge Eliza's inheritance through the courts? "He can challenge anything he wants," Matthew replied grimly. "Whether he can win is another question entirely, but the legal process could tie up our assets for months or years while the case works its way through the courts." The implications of this legal assault settled over them like a dark cloud. For Carter, the strategy was brilliant. By challenging Eliza's legitimacy, he could create enough uncertainty to drive away business partners, discourage investors, and potentially force the ranch into financial difficulty that would make it vulnerable to acquisition. Eliza sat quietly for several minutes, processing this new threat and considering their options. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that surprised even those who had begun to appreciate her strength. "Uncle Matthew, I need you to arrange meetings with the best legal minds in Montana Territory. If Jackson Carter wants a fight over my inheritance, we'll give him one he won't forget." "Are you sure you want to pursue this course?" Matthew asked. "Legal battles can be expensive, time-consuming, and there's always the risk that we could lose." "I've already lost everything once and built a new life from nothing," Eliza replied with quiet intensity. "I'm not going to let a bully steal what I've rightfully inherited without fighting back. Besides," she added with growing confidence, "we have advantages that Carter doesn't expect. We have the truth on our side. We have documentation of my parents' marriage and my birth. Most importantly, we have a cause worth fighting for, not just personal wealth, but the livelihoods of everyone who depends on this ranch." As night fell over the Callahan Ranch, Eliza realized that the education phase of her inheritance was over. Tomorrow would begin the real test of whether the Callahan heir could protect and expand the legacy she had inherited, or whether she would become another casualty of the ruthless business practices that characterized the rapidly changing American West. The battle for her future was about to begin, and Eliza was determined to prove that the daughter of Joseph and Elizabeth Callahan had inherited more than just ranch lands and breeding stock. She had inherited the strength and determination to fight for what was rightfully hers, and she would not be defeated by opponents who mistook her physical disability for weakness. The lost Callahan heir had been found, educated, and was now ready to defend her inheritance against anyone who dared to challenge her right to her family's legacy. The war room that Matthew established in the ranch house's east wing resembled a military command center more than a traditional business. Office. Maps of Montana Territory covered every available wall, marked with colored pins indicating Callahan properties, Carter holdings, and strategic locations that could determine the outcome of their legal battle. Telegraph equipment chattered constantly, with updates from legal representatives, field managers, and allies throughout the region. Eliza stood before the largest map, studying the patterns of land ownership that revealed Carter's systematic acquisition of properties surrounding Callahan. Water rights and access roads. Her copper hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore a simple riding dress that allowed her to move between strategy sessions and ranch operations with equal efficiency. The maple cane that had once seemed a symbol of limitation now served as an extension of her authority as she used it to point out vulnerabilities in their position. Carter's legal challenge buys him time to create practical obstacles to our operations, she observed, indicating a narrow pass where the main road to their northern pastures crossed Carter-controlled land. Even if we win in court, he could make it impossible for us to move horses to market without his cooperation. Judge Sullivan had warned them that the territorial courts moved slowly, especially with complex inheritance cases that might take a year or more to resolve. In the meantime, they needed to secure their business operations against both legal and practical interference. Jonathan Mitchell, the silver-haired attorney who had arrived from Helena to coordinate their defense, nodded in agreement with Eliza's assessment. Carter is playing a two-front war, using the courts to undermine your legitimacy while creating physical and economic barriers to your success. We need to respond on both fronts simultaneously. The preliminary legal response had already been filed, providing documentation of Joseph and Elizabeth's marriage, Eliza's birth records, and affidavits from those who had known the couple. But Mitchell warned that paper evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient against an opponent with Carter's resources and influence. What exactly are we facing in court? Thomas asked, reviewing the legal documents that challenged his daughter's very identity. They're attacking on 3 fronts, Mitchell explained, spreading additional documents across the conference table. First, they're claiming that Joseph and Elizabeth's marriage was never properly recorded with territorial authorities, making it legally invalid. Second, they're arguing that even if the marriage was valid, William Callahan's disinheritance of Joseph means the properties never legally passed to your family line. Third, they're claiming that Elizabeth's remarriage to Thomas Winters constituted abandonment of any Callahan family claims. Eliza studied the legal arguments with growing frustration. So they're essentially arguing that I don't legally exist as a Callahan heir. That's a crude but accurate summary, Mitchell confirmed. If they succeed on any of these arguments, you could lose everything. Matthew had been reviewing correspondence from their political allies, and his expression suggested the news was not encouraging. Governor Chapman sends word that pressure is being applied in Helena to investigate our land grants and water rights. If Carter can create enough doubt about our legitimacy, he might be able to force a review of all our territorial agreements. The scope of the attack was becoming clear to Eliza. This wasn't simply a legal challenge to her inheritance. It was a coordinated assault designed to destroy the Callahan Ranch entirely, erasing her family's legacy from Montana territory. They're not just trying to steal our properties, she said quietly. They're trying to eliminate us as competitors by making it impossible for us to operate. Exactly, Matthew confirmed. Carter represents a consortium of cattle barons who want to control Montana's agricultural development. The Callahan Ranch's independence and family ownership structure makes us an obstacle to their plans for monopolistic control. Their strategy session was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Mrs. Hamilton announced that a delegation from Willow Creek was requesting an audience, led by Mayor Franklin Patterson and accompanied by several prominent local business owners. Eliza joined Matthew in the ranch's formal parlor to meet with the delegation, wondering what additional complications this development might bring. Mayor Patterson was a heavy-set man in his 60s, who had been elected on a platform of supporting local business interests, while his companions represented the merchants and professionals who formed Willow Creek's economic foundation. Mr. Callahan, Miss Callahan, Mayor Patterson began with obvious nervousness. We've come to discuss the situation that's developing around your ranch and what it might mean for our community. What specific concerns do you have? Matthew asked diplomatically. Word has reached us about Carter's legal challenges to Miss Callahan's inheritance, explained Martha Adams, who owned the town's largest general store. There are rumors that if Carter acquires the Callahan Ranch, he'll redirect all business to Riverdale, where he has significant investments. Eliza understood immediately. Willow Creek's prosperity depended on its relationship with the surrounding ranches. The Callahan operation alone employed over 50 people permanently, with seasonal work for dozens more. Their purchases of supplies, use of local services, and contribution to the tax base supported the entire community. What kind of changes are you concerned about? She asked. Carter has a reputation for consolidating operations to maximize profits, replied Dr. Samuel Jenkins, the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens. He might close your breeding program, reduce staff to a skeleton crew, and manage the property solely for cattle grazing, which requires far fewer workers and minimal local services. The delegation's concerns highlighted another dimension of their struggle that Eliza hadn't fully considered. The Callahan Ranch wasn't just her personal inheritance. It was an economic engine that supported the livelihoods of hundreds of people across multiple communities. We want you to know, Mayor Patterson continued, that Willow Creek stands behind your right to your inheritance and your management of the ranch. We're prepared to provide testimony, documentation, or whatever support you need to fight these challenges. Matthew looked genuinely moved by this offer of community support. Mayor Patterson, that's very generous. What specifically can the town provide? Documentation of your family's historical presence and business activities in this region. Dr. Jenkins replied, witness testimony about Joseph Callahan's public acknowledgement of his marriage and child, and political support for your continued operation of ranch services that benefit local communities. Eliza felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected alliance. We appreciate this support more than you know. Our goal is to maintain and expand operations that benefit communities like Willow Creek, not extract maximum profit at the expense of local economies. After the delegation departed, the Callahan family returned to their war room with renewed energy for the fight ahead. The community support demonstrated that they had allies beyond their immediate family and ranch employees, but it also emphasized the stakes involved in their legal battle. We need to go on the offensive, Eliza declared, studying the maps that showed Carter's own vulnerable points. Defending against his attacks isn't enough. We need to create problems for him that force him to divert resources from attacking us. What kind of problems? Thomas asked, impressed by his daughter's strategic thinking. Investigation of his own business practices, Matthew suggested with growing enthusiasm. Carter has acquired numerous properties through questionable methods. If we can document patterns of fraud or coercion, we can turn his legal tactics against him. Jonathan Mitchell looked up from his legal research with interest. That's an aggressive strategy, but it could be effective. If we can prove that Carter has engaged in systematic fraudulent practices, it undermines his credibility and potentially exposes him to criminal prosecution. The afternoon was spent developing a comprehensive counterattack strategy that would hit Carter on multiple fronts simultaneously. Eliza coordinated efforts to document suspicious business practices. Sarah Jenkins worked with loyal ranch hands to gather testimony from those who had been pressured by Carter in the past. And Matthew managed communications with allies who could provide political and economic leverage. Their planning was interrupted by an urgent telegram from one of their horse buyers in Denver, reporting a crisis that demanded immediate attention. A shipment of Callahan breeding stock had been detained at the Colorado border under suspicious circumstances, with officials claiming paperwork irregularities that prevented the valuable animals from reaching their destination. "This has Carter's fingerprints all over it," Matthew said grimly after reading the telegram. "He's using his political connections to interfere with our business operations while the legal case proceeds." The detained horses represented a substantial investment, with buyers already committed and payments pending upon delivery. If the animals couldn't reach Denver, the financial loss would be significant at a time when they needed every resource for their legal fight. "I need to go to the border crossing myself," Eliza said decisively. "This isn't something we can resolve by telegraph." "That's a 3-day journey through difficult territory," Thomas protested, concerned for his daughter's safety and comfort during such an arduous trip. "All the more reason I should go," Eliza replied firmly. "This is Carter testing our resolve and our ability to respond to challenges. If we send subordinates, he'll see it as confirmation that my disability makes me unwilling or unable to defend our interests personally." The journey to the Colorado border would become Eliza's first major test as the face of Callahan Ranch. She departed the following morning in a specially modified buggy that accommodated her mobility needs while providing the speed and reliability required for urgent business travel. Sarah Jenkins accompanied her as both companion and security, the training director's reputation as an expert markswoman, providing protection that discouraged interference. The 3-day journey transformed Eliza in ways that went beyond the physical challenge of extended travel. Each stop brought opportunities to meet with local ranchers, merchants, and officials who had business relationships with the Callahan operation. People who might have dismissed a disabled young woman sight unseen were confronted instead with a knowledgeable, articulate business leader who understood the details of horse breeding, territorial regulations, and market dynamics. By the time they reached the border station where the Callahan horses were detained, Eliza had established a network of supporters who saw her as Joseph, Callahan's worthy successor, rather than an invalid who had stumbled into undeserved wealth. The border station itself presented a formidable challenge, a dusty compound staffed by territorial officials who had clearly been influenced by Carter's representatives. The detained Callahan horses were visible in corrals behind the main building. Magnificent animals whose quality was evident even at a distance. Chief Inspector Morris Taylor met them with the kind of bureaucratic indifference that served as armor against complaints and appeals. "The paperwork for these animals is irregular," he stated without looking up from his desk. "Health certificates missing required signatures, breeding documentation incomplete, export permits filed incorrectly." Eliza had anticipated this obstruction and came prepared. "Inspector Taylor," she said, placing a complete duplicate set of documents before him, "here are copies of all required paperwork, properly executed and filed. You'll note that each form bears the stamp and signature of the Territorial Veterinary Office, the Breeding Registry, and your own department's headquarters in Helena." Taylor examined the documents with obvious discomfort, searching for flaws that didn't exist. "These appear to be in order, but I'll need to verify their authenticity. That could take several days. Perhaps this will help expedite the process." Eliza replied, producing an additional document bearing the governor's seal. "This is a personal letter from Governor Chapman, confirming the legitimate business operations of Callahan Ranch and authorizing immediate release of our property. You'll note that it's dated yesterday, indicating that the governor is personally aware of and involved in resolving this situation." The letter represented Matthew's political connections at their most effective, a direct intervention from territorial leadership that overrode local officials who might be susceptible to Carter's influence. Taylor's face revealed his recognition that he had been placed in an impossible position, caught between Carter's pressure and direct orders from the governor. "I'll need an hour to process the release forms," he said finally, abandoning the pretense of paperwork irregularities. While they waited, Eliza and Sarah examined the detained horses, ensuring that the valuable animals had been properly cared for during their delay. The lead stallion, a magnificent black thoroughbred named Midnight Commander, approached the fence as Eliza drew near, his intelligent eyes studying her with evident curiosity. "He knows your family," Sarah observed as the normally cautious animal allowed Eliza to stroke his sleek neck. "Horses sense things about people that we might miss ourselves." The successful resolution of the border crisis represented Eliza's first significant victory in the larger battle with Carter. Not only had she secured the release of valuable breeding stock, but she had also demonstrated her ability to overcome obstacles through preparation, political connections, and personal intervention. The message to Carter was clear: the Callahan heir was neither helpless nor easily intimidated. The return journey to the ranch brought news of additional developments in their legal battle. Riders intercepted them with telegrams reporting that Mitchell had uncovered records of similar challenges Carter had mounted against other property owners, creating a pattern of abusive legal tactics that could undermine his credibility with the court. More importantly, they learned that Carter's foreman had been overheard in a Riverdale saloon, boasting about plans to divert water from Callahan streams during the crucial spring breeding season, a revelation that allowed them to prepare countermeasures before the damage could be done. Eliza arrived back at the ranch to find the war room buzzing with activity. The community support Mitchell had mentioned was materializing in concrete forms, merchants extending credit during the legal uncertainty, neighboring ranchers offering grazing rights if access to Callahan pastures was blocked, and political allies applying pressure to expedite court proceedings. "Carter underestimated the goodwill your family has built over generations," Mitchell explained as they reviewed the growing list of supporters. "He thought this would be a simple legal maneuver against a vulnerable heir, but he's discovering that attacking the Callahan ranch means taking on half the territory." The most unexpected support came from a source Eliza could never have anticipated. The settlement offer, when it came, revealed just how thoroughly they had demolished Carter's position. He would withdraw all challenges to Eliza's inheritance, sign non-interference agreements regarding Callahan water rights and access roads, and pay substantial damages for his documented harassment. "He's running scared," Matthew observed as they reviewed the proposed terms. "The evidence presented today could lead to criminal charges if pursued further. He's offering significant concessions to end this before the territorial prosecutor becomes involved." Eliza considered the offer carefully, weighing justice against pragmatic considerations. "I want one addition to these terms," she said finally. "Carter must divest his interests in properties acquired through documented fraud and intimidation, with first right of repurchase going to the original owners at the prices they received." The addition represented more than financial justice, was restoration of dignity and heritage to families who had suffered under Carter's predatory practices. When his attorneys returned with his reluctant acceptance of the modified terms, Eliza knew they had achieved something far more significant than merely protecting her own inheritance. Judge Sullivan made the settlement terms part of the official court record, giving them the force of legal judgment that would be difficult to challenge or evade. His closing remarks reflected his satisfaction with the resolution. "This court views the settlement as appropriate remedy for documented abuses that threaten not only individual property rights, but the integrity of our territorial legal system. Let the record show that claims against the legitimacy of Eliza Callahan's inheritance are permanently dismissed, and that the systematic business practices revealed in today's proceedings will be referred to appropriate authorities for potential criminal investigation." As Eliza left the courthouse, she emerged into a crowd of well-wishers from throughout the county. The victory was being celebrated not just as her personal triumph, but as a community's successful stand against the type of predatory business practices that had threatened so many local families. Thomas Winters watched with undisguised pride As townsfolk who had once whispered about poor Crippled, Eliza now approached her with congratulations and expressions of admiration. The transformation in how others perceived her was remarkable, but it paled beside the transformation in how she saw herself. The months that followed brought rapid expansion of Callahan Ranch operations as Eliza applied the lessons she had learned. During their struggle against Carter, she established breeding programs that became models for other ranches, invested in community development projects that strengthened the towns along their trade routes, and pioneered new approaches to ranch management that emphasized cooperation rather than exploitation. Sarah Jenkins' training talents found expression in developing methods that allowed riders with various physical limitations to work effectively with horses, creating opportunities for wounded veterans and others previously excluded from ranch work. Thomas discovered a new calling as an advocate for small ranchers, helping them implement cooperative practices that allowed them to compete with larger operations. On a crisp autumn morning 1 year after the auction that had changed her life, Eliza sat astride Midnight Commander on a hilltop overlooking the vast expanse of Callahan Ranch. The powerful horse stood steady beneath her, compensating instinctively for her uneven weight distribution in a partnership that demonstrated how limitations could be overcome through mutual adaptation. Matthew joined her on his own mount, surveying the property that was thriving under their shared management. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished," he said simply. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if things had happened differently," Eliza replied thoughtfully. "If my mother had claimed her rightful place as Joseph Callahan's widow, if I had grown up with wealth and privilege." "And what do you conclude?" Matthew asked. "That perhaps I needed both experiences to become the person I am now," she said. "The years of struggle taught me perseverance and empathy. The inheritance gave me opportunity and resources. Together, they've allowed me to build something meaningful that helps others find their own strength." The Callahan Ranch had become more than a successful business under Eliza's leadership. It had become a place where people judged themselves and others by character and contribution rather than physical appearance or limitation. The daughter who had once been auctioned to pay her father's debts had transformed an inheritance of property into a legacy of values that would influence the territory for generations to come. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the auction block to becoming one of the most respected business leaders in Montana Territory. The maple cane that still accompanied her on days when riding wasn't practical no longer symbolized weakness to anyone, least of all herself. Instead, it had become a badge of honor, a reminder that true strength comes not from perfect circumstances, but from the determination to overcome whatever obstacles life presents. The frightened young woman who had stood on the courthouse steps facing an uncertain future had been transformed into a confident leader who helped shape the development of the Western Territories. But perhaps the most important transformation had been the discovery that wealth and position were not ends in themselves, but tools that could be used to create opportunities for others. The Callahan Ranch had become more than a successful business under Eliza's leadership. It had become a force for positive change that demonstrated how courage, determination, and compassion could transform both individual lives and entire communities. It was a transformation that went far beyond mere financial success, representing the kind of victory that would inspire others for generations to come. The legacy of the crippled girl who refused to be limited by others' perceptions would eventually extend far beyond Montana Territory, as her innovative management methods and inclusive employment practices became models adopted throughout the American West. But for Eliza herself, the greatest achievement wasn't measured in property or profits, but in the knowledge that she had used her unexpected inheritance to create a world where people were valued for their unique contributions, rather than judged by their limitations. It was a transformation that would inspire generations of others facing their own seemingly impossible challenges, proof that sometimes the greatest victories Begin with the courage to face your darkest moments with dignity and determination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.